Let's talk now about the midbrain. So there's a lot of components to the midbrain. We're going to cover just a handful of the really important ones. So the midbrain here is above the hindbrain, right? Or it is superior to the hindbrain. It is also medial in the brain, right? As opposed to lateral, where we see here on the outer edge of the cortex or the forebrain. Right? It is medial. So if we look the very medial section of the forebrain, we'll see a structure here called the thalamus. The thalamus is right here directly in the middle of the brain and is what we call the sensory gateway. Almost every single sense in the whole entire body is relayed through the thalamus. Touch, taste, sight, hearing. In fact, the only sense that doesn't get relayed through the thalamus is the sense of smell, which goes directly from the nose to the olfactory bulb. The thalamus is where we get what is called the crossover. The crossover is a phenomenon where the left side of the body goes to the right side of the brain, and the right side of the body goes to the left side of the brain. Right? Therefore, the brain controls the contralateral side of the body, right? So the right hemisphere controls the left hemisphere. And incoming sensory information comes in through the thalamus and then splits to the opposite or the contralateral hemisphere. The split in function is where we sometimes get what's called the left and the right brain. And many people may have heard about left or right-brained people, with right-brained people being more empathetic and artistic, and left-brained people being more calculating, more scientific, less emotional. While there's an ounce of truth to the idea that the left and the right hemisphere process things differently, this idea of personality differences based on the dominance of one hemisphere or the other doesn't make any sense and doesn't work out, right? For example, language. The left hemisphere tends to process the meanings, definitions of words, whereas the right hemisphere processes the context, the emotion, the flow of the sentences. Do you need to know the meanings of words to understand what people are telling you? I would argue yes, absolutely. If you don't know what the words mean, you can't communicate. But really, how important is the emotional and context of language, right? Well, most people these days communicate via text message. If context and emotion was so important, you'd think we'd have found some way of adding it to our text messages. It can't be that important. Some of you might be calling me out on this and saying, well, what about emojis? And I think you're exactly right. In fact, the emotion and context is so important to language that we literally built a hieroglyphic language of emotion to send as our text messages. The same message sent with a winky face means something very different if you leave the winky face off. So I'd argue that language requires both the left and the right hemisphere. The left hemisphere tends to be better at processing details, while the right hemisphere processes things holistically. For example, if you look at these two stimuli here, what we have is an M made out of Z's or a triangle made out of squares. People with right hemisphere damage who use the left hemisphere to process the stimulus tend to get the Z's but not the holistic shape, or get the squares but not the holistic shape. People with left hemisphere damage and therefore processing it with the right hemisphere get the overall shape but don't get the details. So if we go back to this idea of the artist, does an artist need to be able to process details or the big picture? Well, both. Does the scientist need to be able to process the big picture or details? Again, both. So I'd actually argue that the left and right hemisphere are both necessary components regardless of one's personality, but there is a grain of truth in this idea that the left and the right hemisphere actually process things differently. Moving above the thalamus, but still very medial in the brain, we have a structure here called the corpus callosum. The corpus callosum is a thick band of axons that allows for communication between the left and the right hemisphere. Right? This is what allows for lateralization to be possible. So why the left and the right hemisphere actually are able to do separate things because the corpus callosum can transfer information very quickly between the two hemispheres. Moving down here into the sort of shoe horse structure shape, we have what's called the hippocampus. The hippocampus is incredibly important in forming memories, particularly what we call episodic memories. And these are memories of specific events in your life. Right? These are the stories you tell. This is as opposed to memories, for example, of how to tie your shoelaces or how to ride a bike. These are procedural memories and are actually stored more in the basal ganglia, which is up over here, whereas the hippocampus down here stores our episodic memories. Attached to the hippocampus is the amygdala, which is this little sort of almond sized structure brain tissue that plays an incredibly important role in processing emotional responses. The amygdala is what allows us to process core emotions like happiness, aggression, sadness, surprise, and disgust, as opposed to processing emotions that are more general, like embarrassment or guilt. Those are more complex and involve more the forebrain than the midbrain. The amygdala is really those core central emotions. Underneath all of this here, we have the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus actually integrates with the endocrine or the hormone system and helps regulate appetite and sex drive and puberty and fertility and all kinds of things, right? So combined, the midbrain structures of the hippocampus, the amygdala, the hypothalamus are often referred to as the limbic system. The limbic system regulates a lot of those core fundamental drives: hunger and food drive, sex drive, aggression, violence, anger. Right? And so you may see this term limbic system used quite a bit. One point, though, is there are many researchers that now think the idea of a separate subsystem devoted to these lower level drives may not be the correct way of describing the system, and that the individual components of the limbic system are no more interconnected with each other than the rest of the brain, and think that the limbic system is an outdated concept. So that's important to know, is that some people reject the idea of a limbic system, but it's still a very popular idea, and you will hear it referred to throughout psychology all the time, and these are these core midbrain structures: hippocampus, hypothalamus, and then the amygdala, right, are the main components of it. That is the main structures of the midbrain.